Delhi Sultanate. Attacks on civilians. Destruction of cities. While the sacking of cities was not uncommon in medieval warfare, the army of the Delhi Sultanate also often completely destroyed cities in their military expeditions. According to Jain chronicler Jinaprabha Suri, Khalji's conquests destroyed hundreds of towns including Ashapalli, Vanthali and Surat in Gujarat. This account is corroborated by Ziauddin Barani. Massacres. Ziauddin Balban wiped out the Rajputs of Mewat and Awadh, killing approximately 100,000 people. Alauddin Khalji ordered the killing of 30,000 people at Chittor. Alauddin Khalji ordered the killing of several prominent Brahmin and merchant civilians as ransom during his raid on Devagiri. Muhammad bin Tughlaq killed 12,000 Hindu ascetics during the sacking of Srirangam. Firuz Shah Tughlaq killed 180,000 people during his invasion of Bengal. Desecration of temples, universities and libraries. Historian Richard Eaton has tabulated a campaign of destruction of idols and temples by Delhi sultans, intermixed with instances of years where the temples were protected from desecration. In his paper, he has listed 37 instances of Hindu temples being desecrated or destroyed in India during the Delhi Sultanate, from 1234 to 1518, for which reasonable evidences are available. He notes that this was not unusual in medieval India, as there were numerous recorded instances of temple desecration by Hindu and Buddhist kings against rival Indian kingdoms between 642 and 1520, involving conflict between devotees of different Hindu deities, as well as between Hindus, Buddhists and Jains. He also noted there were also many instances of Delhi sultans, who often had Hindu ministers, ordering the protection, maintenance and repairing of temples, according to both Muslim and Hindu sources. For example, a Sanskrit inscription notes that Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq repaired a Shiva temple in Bidar after his Deccan conquest. There was often a pattern of Delhi sultans plundering or damaging temples during conquest, and then patronizing or repairing temples after conquest. This pattern came to an end with the Mughal Empire, where Akbar the Great's chief minister Abu al-Fazl criticized the excesses of earlier sultans such as Mahmud of Ghazni. In many cases, the demolished remains, rocks and broken statue pieces of temples destroyed by Delhi sultans were reused to build mosques and other buildings. For example, the Qutbi complex in Delhi was built from stones of 27 demolished Hindu and Jain temples by some accounts. Similarly, the Muslim mosque in Khanapur, Maharashtra was built from the looted parts and demolished remains of Hindu temples. Muhammad bin Bakhtiar Khalji destroyed Buddhist and Hindu libraries and their manuscripts at Nalanda and Odantpuri universities in 1193 AD at the beginning of the Delhi Sultanate. The first historical record of a campaign of destruction of temples and defacement of faces or heads of Hindu idols lasted from 1193 to 1194 in Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana and Uttar Pradesh under the command of Ghuri. Under the Mamluks and Khaljis, the campaign of temple desecration expanded to Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat and Maharashtra, and continued through the late 13th century. The campaign extended to Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu under Malik Kafur and Ulf Khan in the 14th century, and by the Bahmanis in 15th century. Orissa temples were destroyed in the 14th century under the Tughlaqs. Beyond destruction and desecration, the sultans of the Delhi Sultanate in some cases had forbidden reconstruction of damaged Hindu, Jain and Buddhist temples, and they prohibited repairs of old temples or construction of any new temples. In certain cases, the Sultanate would grant a permit for repairs and construction of temples if the patron or religious community paid jizya. For example, a proposal by the Chinese to repair Himalayan Buddhist temples destroyed by the Sultanate army was refused, on the grounds that such temple repairs were only allowed if the Chinese agreed to pay jizya tax to the treasury of the Sultanate. In his memoirs, Firuz Shah Tughlaq describes how he destroyed temples and built mosques instead and killed those who dared build new temples. Other historical records from viziers, amirs and the court historians of various sultans of the Delhi Sultanate describe the grandeur of idols and temples they witnessed in their campaigns and how these were destroyed and desecrated. Economy. Many historians argue that the Delhi Sultanate was responsible for making India more multicultural and cosmopolitan. The establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in India has been compared to the expansion of the Mongol Empire and called part of a larger trend occurring throughout much of Eurasia, in which nomadic people migrated from the steppes of Inner Asia and became politically dominant. According to Angus Maddison, between the years 1000 and 1500, India's GDP, of which the Sultanates represented a significant part, grew nearly 80% to $60.5 billion in 1500. However, these numbers should be viewed in context. According to Madison's estimates, India's population grew by nearly 50% in the same time period, amounting to a per capita GDP growth of around 20%. World GDP more than doubled in the same period, and India's per capita GDP fell behind that of China, with which it was previously at par. India's GDP share of the world declined under the Delhi Sultanate from nearly 30% to 25% and would continue to decline until the mid-20th century. In terms of mechanical devices, later Mughal Emperor Babur provides a description of the use of the water wheel in the Delhi Sultanate, which some historians have taken to suggest that the water wheel was introduced to India under the Delhi Sultanate. However, this has been criticized e.g. by Siddiqui, and there is significant evidence that the device existed in India prior to this. Some have also suggested that the spinning wheel was introduced to India from Iran during the Delhi Sultanate, though most scholars believe that it was invented in India in the first millennium. The worm gear roller cotton gin was invented in the 13th or 14th centuries. However, Irfan Habib states that the development likely occurred in peninsular India, which was not under the rule of the Delhi Sultanate. Although India was the first region outside China to use paper and papermaking reached India as early as the 6th to 7th centuries, its use only became widespread in northern India in the 13th century and southern India between the 15th and 16th centuries. However, it is not clear if this change can be attributed to the Delhi Sultanate, as 15th century Chinese traveller Ma Wan remarks that Indian paper was white and made from bark of a tree, similar to the Chinese method of papermaking, suggesting a direct route from China for the arrival of paper. Society. Demographics. According to one set of the very uncertain estimates of modern historians, the total Indian population had largely been stagnant at 75 million during the Middle Kingdom's era from 1 AD to 1000 AD. During the medieval Delhi Sultanate era from 1000 to 1500, India as a whole experienced lasting population growth for the first time in 1,000 years, with its population increasing nearly 50% to 110 million by 1500 AD. Culture. While the Indian subcontinent has had invaders from Central Asia since ancient times, what made the Muslim invasions different is that unlike the preceding invaders who assimilated into the prevalent social system, the successful Muslim conquerors retained their Islamic identity and created new legal and administrative systems that challenged and usually in many cases superseded the existing systems of social conduct and ethics. Even influencing the non-Muslim rivals and common masses to a large extent, though the non-Muslim population was left to their own laws and customs. They also introduced new cultural codes that in some ways were very different from the existing cultural codes. This led to the rise of a new Indian culture which was mixed in nature, different from ancient Indian culture. The overwhelming majority of Muslims in India were Indian natives converted to Islam. This factor also played an important role in the synthesis of cultures. The Hindustani language began to emerge in the Delhi Sultanate period, developed from the Middle Indo-Aryan Apabhramsha vernaculars of North India. Amir Khusro, who lived in the 13th century CE during the Delhi Sultanate period in North India, used a form of Hindustani, which was the lingua franca of the period, in his writings and referred to it as Hindavi. Architecture. The start of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206 under Qutb al-Din Aibak introduced a large Islamic state to India, using Central Asian styles. The types and forms of large buildings required by Muslim elites, with mosques and tombs much the most common, were very different from those previously built in India. The exteriors of both were very often topped by large domes and made extensive use of arches. Both of these features were hardly used in Hindu temple architecture and other indigenous Indian styles. Both types of building essentially consist of a single large space under a high dome and completely avoid the figurative sculpture so important to Hindu temple architecture. The important Qutbi complex in Delhi was begun under Muhammad of Ghor by 1199 and continued under Qutb al-Din Aibak and later sultans. The Quwa-ul-Islam Mosque, now a ruin, was the first structure. Like other early Islamic buildings, it reused elements such as columns from destroyed Hindu and Jain temples, including one on the same site whose platform was reused. The style was Iranian, but the arches were still cobbled in the traditional Indian way. Beside it is the extremely tall Qutbi Minar, a minaret or victory tower, whose original 4 stages reach 73 meters. Its closest comparator is the 62-meter all-brick minaret of Jam in Afghanistan of c. 1190, a decade or so before the probable start of the Delhi Tower. The surfaces of both are elaborately decorated with inscriptions and geometric patterns. In Delhi, the shaft is fluted with superb stalactite bracketing under the balconies at the top of each stage. In general, minarets were slow to be used in India and are often detached from the main mosque where they exist. The tomb of Iltutmish was added by 1236, its dome, the squinches again cobbled, is now missing, and the intricate carving has been described as having an angular harshness from carvers working in an unfamiliar tradition. Other elements were added to the complex over the next 2 centuries. Another very early mosque, begun in the 1190s, is the Adhai Din Ka Jonpra in Ajmer, Rajasthan, built for the same Delhi rulers, again with cobbled arches and domes. Here Hindu temple columns are piled up in threes to achieve extra height. Both mosques had large detached screens with pointed cobbled arches added in front of them, probably under Iltutmish a couple of decades later. In these the central arch is taller, in imitation of an Iwan. At Ajmer the smaller screen arches are tentatively cusped, for the first time in India. By around 1300 true domes and arches with voussoirs were being built. The ruined tomb of Balban in Delhi may be the earliest survival. The Alai Darwaza gatehouse at the Qutbi complex, from 1311, still shows a cautious approach to the new technology, with very thick walls and a shallow dome, only visible from a certain distance or height. Bold contrasting colors of masonry, with red sandstone and white marble, introduce what was to become a common feature of Indo-Islamic architecture, substituting for the polychrome tiles used in Persia and Central Asia. The pointed arches come together slightly at their base, giving a mild horseshoe arch effect, and their internal edges are not cusped but lined with conventionalized spearhead projections, possibly representing lotus buds. Jali, stone openwork screens, are introduced here. They already had been long used in temples. Tughlaq architecture. The tomb of Shah Ran-e-Alam in Multan, Pakistan is a large octagonal brick-built mausoleum with polychrome glazed decoration that remains much closer to the styles of Iran and Afghanistan. Timber is also used internally. This was the earliest major monument of the Tughlaq dynasty, built during the unsustainable expansion of its massive territory. It was built for a Sufi saint rather than a sultan, and most of the many Tughlaq tombs are much less exuberant. The tomb of the founder of the dynasty, Ghiyas al-Din Tughlaq, is more austere, but impressive. Like a Hindu temple, it is topped with a small amalaka and a round finial like a kalasha. Unlike the buildings mentioned previously, it completely lacks carved texts, and sits in a compound with high walls and battlements. Both these tombs have external walls sloping slightly inwards by 25 degrees in the Delhi tomb, like many fortifications including the ruined Tughlaqabad fort opposite the tomb, intended as the new capital. The Tughlaqs had a corps of government architects and builders, and in this and other roles employed many Hindus. They left many buildings, and a standardized dynastic style. The third Sultan, Firuz Shah, is said to have designed buildings himself, and was the longest ruler and greatest builder of the dynasty. His Firuz Shah Palace complex at Hisar, Haryana is a ruin, but parts are in fair condition. Some buildings from his reign take forms that had been rare or unknown in Islamic buildings. He was buried in the large Hoskas complex in Delhi, with many other buildings from his period and the later Sultanate, including several small domed pavilions supported only by columns. By this time Islamic architecture in India had adopted some features of earlier Indian architecture, such as the use of a high plinth, and often mouldings around its edges, as well as columns and brackets and hypostyle halls. After the death of Firoz, the Tughlaqs declined, and the following Delhi dynasties were weak. Most of the monumental buildings constructed were tombs, although the impressive Lodi gardens in Delhi were constructed by the late Lodi dynasty. The architecture of other regional Muslim states was often more impressive.